They wore the same uniform. They saluted the same flag. But deep inside, they knew something was wrong. When you think about Nazi Germany, you imagine absolute loyalty, total control, unwavering obedience. The reality was different. There were Nazis who turned against their own leader, officers who plotted in the shadows, and party members who risked everything to stop what they'd helped create. What happened to them? The price they paid was unimaginable, and their stories have been buried in the footnotes of history for decades. Ernst Röhm wasn't just any Nazi. He was one of Hitler's oldest friends, one of the first believers in the movement. Back in the early 1920s, when Hitler was still an angry war veteran ranting in beer halls, Röhm was there, helping him build the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Brownshirts. By 1934, the SA had grown into a massive force of nearly 3 million men. Röhm had ambitions. He wanted the SA to replace the traditional German army, the Reichswehr. He talked about a second revolution, about finishing what the Nazi Party had started. The generals didn't like it. The industrialists who'd funded Hitler's rise didn't like it. And Hitler himself began to see Röhm as a problem. The SA was powerful, unpredictable, and increasingly difficult to control. They were violent thugs who'd served their purpose during Hitler's rise to power, but now they were an embarrassment to a chancellor trying to legitimize his government. Röhm kept pushing, kept talking about his vision for a people's army led by the SA. On June 30th, 1934, Hitler made his move. He flew to Munich with SS troops, then drove to Bad Weisse, where Röhm and other SA leaders were staying at a hotel. Hitler personally arrested Röhm. Over the next 3 days, SS execution squads fanned out across Germany, hunting down SA commanders. The killings went beyond the SA. Hitler used the opportunity to settle old scores. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was shot dead in his home along with his wife. Conservative politicians who'd criticized the regime were eliminated. Gregor Strasser, once a powerful Nazi who dared to disagree with Hitler's direction, was murdered in a Gestapo cell. Röhm was held in a Munich prison. Hitler initially hesitated to have his old friend executed. They'd been through so much together. But Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring pressured him. On July 1st, 2 SS guards entered Röhm's cell and offered him a pistol to take his own life. Röhm refused. He reportedly said he'd rather have Hitler do it himself. The guards shot him where he stood. When it was over, at least 85 people were dead, though the real number may have reached several hundred. Hitler addressed the Reichstag on July 13th and declared himself the supreme judge of the German people. He'd murdered dozens without trial, and the German courts did nothing. The military leadership thanked him. The Night of the Long Knives proved that Hitler would eliminate anyone who threatened his power, even his closest allies. But the lesson went deeper than that. Röhm hadn't opposed Hitler's ideology. He'd simply wanted too much power for himself. The SA had been loyal Nazis, and they'd been slaughtered anyway. If even true believers could be killed so easily, what chance did actual opponents have? Not all opposition came from within the party. As Hitler pushed Germany toward war in the late 1930s, certain military officers began to realize they were following a madman. These weren't Democrats or liberals. They were conservative, nationalist officers who'd spent their lives serving Germany. But they could see the catastrophe Hitler was building. General Ludwig Beck was one of them. He'd served as chief of the Army General Staff, one of the most prestigious positions in the German military. In 1938, when Hitler announced plans to invade Czechoslovakia, Beck understood what it meant. Germany would face Britain and France. The country wasn't ready for that war. Beck wrote memorandums arguing against Hitler's strategy. He urged other generals to resign in protest. When they wouldn't, Beck resigned himself in August 1938. He'd sacrificed his career, but he'd kept his principles. That was just the beginning of his resistance. Beck became a central figure in the growing conspiracy against Hitler. His apartment in Berlin became a meeting place for other officers, civil servants, and diplomats who wanted to stop the regime. They talked, they planned, but for years they didn't act. They were waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity. Hans Oster was another military man who turned against Hitler early. A colonel in the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, Oster began actively working against the regime as early as 1938. He used his position to shield people the Gestapo was hunting. He passed information to foreign governments, warning them about Hitler's military plans. In 1940, Oster did something extraordinary. He gave the Dutch military attaché the exact date of the planned German invasion of the Netherlands. The attaché reported it to his government. But the Dutch didn't believe it. When the invasion came on the predicted day, it was already too late. Oster kept working from inside the Abwehr for years. The intelligence service became a haven for resistance members, protected somewhat by its chief, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. They worked quietly, documenting Nazi crimes, maintaining contacts with the Allies, and preparing for a future without Hitler. The men in these circles knew they were committing treason under German law. They accepted it. In late 1943, Axel von dem Busche, a young army officer, openly told conspirators that he was committing high treason with all means at his disposal. There was no pretending anymore. They'd crossed the line, and there was no going back. But the question remained, how do you remove a dictator who controls everything? The answer, they decided, was to end him permanently. And that's what leads us to the most famous attempt on Hitler's life. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg was an aristocrat and a German patriot. He'd been a skilled military officer, serving with distinction in the campaigns in Poland, France, and North Africa. In Tunisia in 1943, he was severely wounded. He lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. While recovering, Stauffenberg made his decision. Hitler had to be stopped. By 1944, the war was clearly lost. The Soviet army was crushing German forces in the east. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Germany faced total destruction, and Hitler refused to seek peace. Stauffenberg believed removing Hitler might allow Germany to negotiate an armistice. In July 1944, Stauffenberg was appointed Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army, a position that gave him access to Hitler's military briefings. The conspirators had tried at least 5 times before to get close enough to Hitler to use a bomb or pistol. Each time, something went wrong. The meeting was canceled. Hitler left early. Security was too tight. Stauffenberg knew this might be his only chance. The plan was elaborate. After planting the bomb and confirming Hitler's death, the conspirators would launch Operation Valkyrie, a contingency plan for dealing with internal unrest. They'd use it to arrest Nazi leaders, seize control of key installations in Berlin, and install a new government. Karl Goerdeler would become chancellor. Ludwig Beck would be president. On July 20th, Stauffenberg flew to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. He carried a briefcase containing 2 bombs. When he arrived, he learned the meeting location had been changed. Instead of the concrete bunker, they'd meet in a wooden conference barracks because of the summer heat. The building had windows and thin walls. The bomb's effectiveness would be reduced. Worse, when Stauffenberg excused himself to prime the explosives, a phone call interrupted him. He only had time to arm one of the 2 bombs. He returned to the conference room and placed the briefcase under the heavy oak table, as close to Hitler as possible. Then he made an excuse about a phone call and left the building. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The blast destroyed the conference room. A stenographer died instantly. 3 officers later died from their wounds. Stauffenberg, watching from a distance, was convinced no one could have survived. He and his aide bluffed their way through 3 military checkpoints and flew back to Berlin to begin the coup. But Hitler had survived. Someone had moved the briefcase to the far side of the table's massive oak leg. The leg shielded Hitler from the full force of the explosion. His trousers were shredded, his eardrums damaged, but he was alive and conscious. In Berlin, the conspirators hesitated. Contradictory information arrived. Was Hitler dead or not? Should they proceed with the coup or wait? By the time Stauffenberg arrived and assured them Hitler was dead, precious hours had been lost. Some military units began following Valkyrie orders, but others remained loyal to Hitler. By evening, the coup was falling apart. When Hitler himself spoke on the radio that night, proving he was alive, the remaining support collapsed. General Friedrich Fromm, who'd known about the plot but stayed on the sidelines, decided to prove his loyalty by arresting the conspirators. That night, in the courtyard of the Bendler Block military headquarters in Berlin, Stauffenberg and 3 other conspirators were executed by firing squad. Stauffenberg reportedly shouted, "Long live sacred Germany," before the bullets hit him. Beck was allowed to take his own life, but when his pistol failed to complete the job, a sergeant finished it. The revenge was just beginning. Hitler survived the July 20th plot with minor injuries, but his rage was absolute. He ordered a massive investigation. The Gestapo rounded up anyone connected to the conspiracy, anyone who'd ever expressed doubts about the regime, anyone who seemed suspicious. The trials began in August 1944. Roland Freisler, president of the People's Court, presided. These weren't real trials. They were theatrical performances designed to humiliate the accused before executing them. Freisler screamed at the defendants, insulted them, and made a mockery of legal procedure. The conspirators were denied proper defense attorneys. They stood in the courtroom wearing old clothes, sometimes without belts, so their pants sagged, deliberately humiliated for the cameras. The proceedings were filmed on Hitler's orders. He wanted to watch his enemies' final moments. The sentences were predetermined: death. But Hitler didn't want quick executions. He wanted them to suffer. The condemned were hanged with thin cord from hooks mounted on rails. They were lifted slowly, strangling over several minutes rather than dying from a quick drop that would break the neck. Stauffenberg's brother Berthold was among those executed this way on August 10th. Before he died, he was strangled nearly to death, then revived, then strangled again. This happened multiple times while cameras recorded everything for Hitler to view later. Over 200 people directly connected to the July 20th plot were executed, but Hitler's purge went far beyond the actual conspirators. He used the plot as an excuse to eliminate anyone he'd ever distrusted. Thousands more were arrested. Some estimates suggest up to 5,000 people were killed in the aftermath. The regime even implemented Sippenhaft, a policy of family liability. Relatives of the conspirators were arrested, even if they'd known nothing about the plot. Stauffenberg's wife and children were imprisoned. Other families were sent to concentration camps. The message was clear: opposing Hitler wouldn't just cost your life, it would cost your family's lives too. Hans Oster, the Abwehr officer who'd been working against Hitler since 1938, was arrested after the July plot. He'd been under suspicion for months. The Gestapo had finally found enough evidence to connect him to the conspiracy. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany, Oster was executed at Flossenburg concentration camp. Admiral Canaris, his superior who'd protected the resistance circle in the Abwehr, was executed at the same time. They died just weeks before the war ended. Had they survived a few more weeks, they would have been free. Not all opposition came from military officers or party insiders. Some came from young people who simply couldn't accept what Germany had become. In Munich, at Ludwig Maximilian University, a small group of students decided to fight back with words. Hans Scholl, his sister Sophie Scholl, Alexander Schmorl, Christoph Probst, Willy Graf, and Professor Kurt Huber formed the White Rose Resistance Group. They began writing and distributing leaflets in the summer of 1942. The leaflets were extraordinary. They were eloquent, philosophical, and direct in their condemnation of the Nazi regime. They talked about the crimes being committed in the name of Germany. They urged passive resistance. They quoted philosophers and poets. In a society where nearly everyone marched in lockstep with the regime, the White Rose dared to speak truth. Hans and Alexander produced the first leaflets on a duplicating machine, making copies late at night. They mailed them to addresses chosen randomly from phone books, focusing on academics and professionals. The leaflets appeared in different cities. People found them in their mailboxes and wondered who was brave or foolish enough to write such things. Sophie joined the group's inner circle in early 1943. As a woman, she attracted less suspicion from the SS. She could move around Munich more freely, helping distribute the leaflets and materials. The group expanded their efforts, writing slogans like "Down with Hitler" and "Freedom" on building walls at night. By February 1943, they'd produced 6 leaflets. They were getting bolder. On February 18th, Hans and Sophie brought a suitcase full of their 6th leaflet to the university. They placed stacks in empty corridors for students to find. When they noticed they had some left over, Sophie threw the remaining leaflets from the top floor into the atrium. A janitor named Jakob Schmid saw them. He seized the siblings and called the Gestapo. Hans and Sophie were arrested immediately. The interrogations were brutal. The Gestapo wanted names. They wanted to know everyone involved. Hans and Sophie tried to take all the blame, to protect their friends. But the Gestapo found a draft of a 7th leaflet in Hans's possession. The handwriting matched Christoph Probst's. He was arrested on February 20th. On February 22nd, just 4 days after their arrest, the 3 stood trial before the People's Court. It was a show trial, lasting only half a day. They had no real defense. Roland Freisler sentenced them to death for high treason. That same afternoon, they were executed. Sophie Scholl was 21 years old. Hans was 24. Christoph Probst was 23. They were taken to Stadelheim prison and killed by guillotine, one after another. Sophie remained composed until the end. When Freisler asked if she understood her actions were a crime against the community, she replied that she'd done what she believed was right. She showed no regret. The executions didn't end the White Rose. Other members were arrested in the following weeks. Professor Kurt Huber, Willy Graf, and Alexander Schmorell were tried in April and executed. At least 60 people connected to the White Rose faced trial. Many received long prison sentences. The regime tried to suppress news of the White Rose, but word spread. A copy of their 6th leaflet reached the Allies. In the summer of 1943, British planes dropped millions of copies over Germany, retitled The Manifesto of the Students of Munich. The White Rose didn't stop the war. They didn't topple the regime, but they proved that not everyone in Germany accepted what was happening. In the darkest time, when speaking out meant certain death, they spoke anyway. Not everyone who opposed Hitler took dramatic action. Some worked in smaller ways, helping victims of the regime, protecting people the Nazis wanted to destroy. These acts of quiet resistance were just as dangerous. Oskar Schindler wasn't opposed to making money. He joined the Nazi Party, used his connections in the Abwehr, and bought a factory in occupied Poland. But when he saw what was happening to Jewish workers, something changed. He began protecting them, bribing SS guards, spending his entire fortune to keep them safe. By the end of the war, Schindler had saved over 1,000 Jewish people by employing them in his factory and keeping them out of the death camps. He went bankrupt doing it. After the war, he struggled financially, supported by the people he'd saved. Wilhelm Hosenfeld was a Wehrmacht captain who served in occupied Poland. He hid and rescued numerous Polish people, including the pianist Władysław Szpilman, whose story was told in the film The Pianist. Hosenfeld helped people because he couldn't accept what Germany was doing, even while wearing a German uniform. There were church leaders who resisted, though carefully. Martin Niemöller was a Lutheran pastor who initially supported some Nazi policies, but turned against the regime when it tried to control the churches. He helped found the Confessing Church, which rejected Nazi ideology. In 1937, he was arrested. He spent 7 years in concentration camps. These people didn't plot coups or plant bombs. They simply refused to participate in the worst of what the regime demanded. Many paid with their freedom or their lives anyway. By the time Hitler consolidated power in 1933-34, the instruments of control were already in place. The SA, and later the SS, the Gestapo, a system of informants and surveillance that made organizing dangerous. The concentration camps for political prisoners opened within months of Hitler becoming chancellor. Early opposition came from communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. The Nazi regime crushed these groups systematically. Party offices were raided. Leaders were arrested. By the mid-1930s, organized political opposition inside Germany had been largely eliminated. The regime was also popular. The economy improved after the Depression. Unemployment fell. Hitler's foreign policy victories in the late 1930s made him seem like a genius. Most Germans supported him, or at least didn't oppose him enough to risk their lives. For those who did oppose Hitler, the obstacles were immense. They had to find trustworthy allies in a society full of informants. They had to avoid the Gestapo, which had files on anyone suspected of disloyalty. They had to access resources like printing equipment, which was controlled and monitored. And they had to accept that success was unlikely, and the price of failure was death. The military conspirators faced their own unique problems. German military tradition emphasized oath-keeping and obedience. Officers swore personal loyalty to Hitler as Führer. Breaking that oath, even for moral reasons, went against everything they'd been trained to believe. Many generals knew Hitler was leading Germany to disaster, but couldn't bring themselves to act against him. There were also practical problems. Hitler's security was extensive. He changed his schedule constantly. He limited access to his person. Multiple assassination attempts failed because Hitler canceled meetings at the last minute or left locations earlier than expected. And there was the question of what came after. If Hitler was removed, what then? Would the military take control? Would there be civil war? Would the Allies negotiate? Or would they demand Germany's unconstitutional surrender? The conspirators spent as much time debating these questions as they did planning the actual assassination. The July 20th plot failed partly because of bad luck, and partly because of these hesitations. When Hitler survived, some conspirators lost their nerve. They'd spent so long planning and debating that when the moment came, they couldn't act decisively enough. Beyond the famous plots and resistance groups, there were countless smaller acts of defiance. People who refused to give the Hitler salute, workers who sabotaged production in factories, citizens who secretly listened to BBC broadcasts and shared what they heard. The Edelweiss Pirates were groups of working-class youth who rejected the Hitler Youth. They went hiking, listened to jazz, and sometimes got into fights with Hitler Youth patrols. As the war continued, some groups became more political, distributing anti-Nazi leaflets and helping deserters. In 1943, a group of teenage Edelweiss Pirates in Cologne, including 16-year-old Bartholomäus Schenk, participated in attacks on Nazi facilities and helped hide deserters and escaped forced laborers. The Gestapo cracked down hard. 13 members of the Cologne group, including Schenk, were publicly hanged in November 1944 without trial. There were protests too, though rare. In 1943, when the Gestapo rounded up Jewish men married to non-Jewish women in Berlin, their wives gathered at Rosenstrasse to demand their husbands' release. For a week, women stood outside the building where their husbands were held, despite SS threats. Remarkably, the regime backed down. Most of the men were released. It was one of the few times public protest in Nazi Germany achieved results. These smaller acts mattered because they showed that complete compliance was never total. Even in a totalitarian state, some people found ways to resist. The regime had to expend resources watching for dissent, investigating suspects, maintaining the apparatus of control. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west in early 1945, Hitler ordered the execution of prisoners he still held. He wanted his enemies dead before the regime collapsed. In early April, the SS transported several prominent prisoners to Flossenbürg concentration camp. Among them were Hans Oster, Admiral Canaris, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor who'd been part of the resistance and used his church contacts to help Jews escape Germany. On April 9, 1945, just a month before Germany's surrender, these men were executed. They'd survived years of imprisonment only to be killed in the final days of the regime. Bonhoeffer was especially calm before his execution. His last words, spoken to a fellow prisoner, were a message for a friend in England. "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." Georg Elser had been imprisoned since November 1939. He was a carpenter who'd acted alone, planting a bomb in a Munich beer hall where Hitler was scheduled to give a speech. The bomb exploded, killing 8 people, but Hitler had left earlier than expected. Elser was arrested at the Swiss border hours later. He'd been held in special custody for over 5 years. Hitler wanted to put him on public trial after Germany won the war, to show how he'd been targeted by foreign conspirators. But there would be no trial. On April 9th, the same day as the executions at Flossenbürg, Elser was taken to Dachau concentration camp and shot. They died with Germany's defeat imminent, with Allied troops liberating concentration camps and German cities falling one after another. A few more weeks, and they would have been free. After the war, Germany struggled with how to remember those who'd opposed Hitler from within. In East Germany, the communist government largely ignored the military conspirators and conservative resistors. They didn't fit the socialist narrative of resistance. The communist leadership wanted to emphasize working-class opposition, the communists and social democrats who'd fought the Nazis from the beginning. Conservative aristocratic officers like Stauffenberg were problematic figures for that story. In West Germany, there was initial ambivalence too. Many former Wehrmacht officers had survived the war. They'd served Hitler loyally until the end. Some saw the July 20th conspirators as traitors who'd violated their military oath, who'd stabbed Germany in the back during wartime. The Stauffenberg family name was tainted for years. His widow struggled. His children grew up under the shadow of their father being labeled a traitor. The first commemoration of the July 20th plot in West Germany didn't happen until 1952, 7 years after the war. Even then, it was controversial. Former generals who'd served the regime debated whether the conspirators had done the right thing. In the 1950s, surveys showed that many West Germans still viewed the July 20th plotters negatively. It took decades for Germany to fully embrace the memory of the resistance. Slowly, through the 1960s and 70s, perspectives shifted. A new generation asked harder questions about what their parents had done during the Nazi years. The resistance figures began to be seen differently, not as traitors, but as Germans who'd tried to save their country from total destruction. The first unified German commemoration of the July 20th plot didn't occur until 1990, after reunification. For 45 years, East and West Germany had remembered the resistance differently, or in some cases barely remembered it at all. Today, the Bendler block in Berlin, where Stauffenberg was executed, houses the German Resistance Memorial Center. The courtyard where he died is preserved as a memorial site. Visitors can stand where he stood before the firing squad. Streets and schools are named after White Rose members across Germany. Sophie Scholl is held up as a symbol of moral courage, her face on postage stamps and memorials. There are museums dedicated to the resistance. Annual ceremonies on July 20th and February 22nd. The dates of the major executions. German politicians give speeches honoring these people who stood against the regime. The resistance figures have become part of Germany's national story about confronting its past, but the evolution of this memory is important. For many years, there was an uncomfortable truth that couldn't be easily resolved. Most of these resistors had initially supported the Nazi regime. Stauffenberg was a German nationalist who'd served Hitler loyally for years before turning against him. He'd fought in Poland, in France, in North Africa, all in service of Hitler's wars of conquest. Hans Scholl had been an enthusiastic Hitler youth leader before becoming disillusioned. Even Sophie Scholl had been a member of the League of German Girls, the female branch of Hitler Youth. They opposed Hitler not from the beginning, but when they finally understood what the regime truly was. Some opposed him for moral reasons, genuinely disgusted by the crimes being committed in Germany's name. Others opposed him for practical reasons, seeing that he was leading Germany to total destruction and hoping a new government could negotiate better peace terms with the Allies. The White Rose students underwent profound transformations. Hans Scholl served on the Eastern Front and witnessed atrocities that shattered whatever loyalty he'd once felt. He saw what German forces were doing to civilians, to Jews, to prisoners. He came back to Munich a different person. Sophie's opposition grew from philosophical and religious convictions, from reading banned books and discussing ideas that the regime considered dangerous. The military conspirators often came to opposition later, and for different reasons. Many had no problem with Nazi ideology initially. They were nationalists who wanted Germany to be strong and powerful, but they couldn't accept Hitler's military incompetence, his refusal to listen to professional advice, his insistence on fighting to the last German. Their opposition was often patriotic in nature, believing that removing Hitler was the only way to save Germany from complete annihilation. The question remains, were they heroes, or were they participants who realized too late what they'd supported? The answer is probably both. They failed to stop the regime. They failed to prevent the Holocaust. They failed to end the war earlier, which might have saved millions of lives. By the time most of them acted, it was already too late to change the outcome. Yet they tried. In a system designed to crush all dissent, they found ways to resist. They risked everything, knowing their chances of success were minimal. They watched their friends die and kept going. They understood that even if they failed, bearing witness mattered. Making the attempt mattered. Germany's memory of these figures continues to evolve. Modern historians examine them with more nuance, acknowledging both their courage and their complicity. School curricula teach about the resistance not as simple heroes, but as complex individuals who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. The resistance is held up not as redemption for Germany's crimes, but as evidence that even in the darkest times, moral choice remained possible. Their stories are taught because Germany wants its citizens to understand that everyone faces choices, that following orders isn't an excuse, that recognizing evil and opposing it, even when success seems impossible, is sometimes the only moral option. The resistance figures, with all their flaws and contradictions, show that people can change, can recognize their mistakes, can choose differently even when that choice means certain death. The Nazis who opposed Hitler paid with their lives. They were shot, hanged, and beheaded. They were tortured by the Gestapo, humiliated in show trials, and executed while cameras filmed for Hitler's entertainment. Their families were arrested under policies of collective guilt. Their names were erased from official records. The regime wanted them forgotten, wanted their defiance to leave no trace. They faced a regime that controlled everything, that had informants everywhere, that would pursue revenge even as the whole structure collapsed around it. And they opposed it anyway, knowing the cost. They knew what happened to people who resisted. They'd seen the consequences. They did it anyway. Some opposed Hitler because of moral convictions, appalled by what Germany had become. They couldn't accept the atrocities, couldn't live with knowing what was being done in their country's name. Some opposed him because they saw military disaster ahead, because they understood that Hitler's strategy would lead to Germany's total destruction. Some opposed him because they believed Germany could still be saved if he was removed, that there was still time to negotiate an armistice and spare the country from obliteration. Their motivations varied, but their fate was the same. They were outnumbered by those who served Hitler loyally to the end. For every officer who joined the July 20th conspiracy, there were hundreds who remained faithful. For every student who distributed White Rose leaflets, there were thousands who never questioned what they were told. The resistors were too few, too late, and too divided to change the course of history, but they existed. In a society that demanded absolute obedience, some refused to obey. In a regime that punished dissent with death, some dissented anyway. They proved that totalitarian control is never total, that even the most thorough surveillance state can't eliminate all opposition, that the human conscience can't be completely suppressed. The story of those who opposed Hitler from within is not a triumphant tale of resistance. It's a tragic story of people who realized, too late, that they'd helped create a monster. Many of them had worn the uniform, had served the regime, had believed in the cause before they understood what it truly meant. But it's also a story about the human capacity to recognize evil and fight against it, even when fighting is hopeless. Their deaths mattered. Their courage, however flawed and late in coming, mattered. They stood as proof that even in the darkest system, with death the price of defiance, some people will choose conscience over survival. They lost everything: their lives, their families, their futures. But they kept something that millions of their countrymen surrendered: their moral agency, their ability to say no. We remember them not because they succeeded, but because they tried. We remember them not to absolve Germany of its crimes, but to show that in every system, no matter how brutal, individuals still make choices. We remember them because their failures teach us something important: that waiting until it's safe to resist means waiting too long, that opposing evil early requires less courage than opposing it when it's already powerful. They were Nazis who opposed Hitler, and they paid the ultimate price. Their story reminds us that redemption is possible, but it's costly. That changing your mind about a cause you once believed in takes tremendous courage. That standing up when everyone around you is sitting down, speaking when everyone else is silent, means accepting that you might stand and speak alone. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.